Fulbright. I'm delighted to be part of today's event. First, because I've long found Turkey one of the world's most fascinating countries, and I'm so pleased to make contact with the Rumi Forum, but also to introduce David Kaleo. David is not only one of the most knowledgeable, but also one of the wisest thinkers and writers about Western Europe, U.S.-European relations, America's broader role in the world, and the economic underpinnings of that role. That last dimension gives him an enormous advantage over so many others who write in this area. He is a devoted teacher and mentor of younger scholars, but the rest of us know him, of course, primarily through his writing. Sometimes on individual European countries, Britain, Germany, but more often on the wider context. Things like Europe's Future in 1965 and Rethinking Europe's Future in 2001, 36 years later. He enjoys being an intellectual troublemaker, which and I mean that as high praise, which means that when he's challenging conventional authority, he's enormously entertaining to read as well as enlightening. But some of the things he's written over the years that some initially dismissed as radical now seem more prescient by the day. Atlantic Fantasies in the early 1970s and Beyond American Hegemony, the Future of the Western Alliance in 1987, I believe, 2 years before the Cold War ended. Themes that now have been picked up by a great many other commentators, but David was, as usual, ahead of the intellectual pack. He's also a good friend, so I have to admit to prejudice, but in the immortal words of Henry Kissinger when commenting on one of his own speeches, everything I've said about him has the added advantage of being true. So, David Kaleo.
Well, thank you very much. Thank all of you for coming, and thank Professor Yurtsever for organizing all this, and the Rumi Forum. Thank you, Janan, for a very, not only very warm and flattering introduction, but one I really appreciate because of the source. John has been deeply involved with American foreign policy for a long time, so it's praise which I relish. Anyway, I guess my job is to explain what's in the book in a half hour or so. And it's not so easy summarizing this book because it has a lot of quite disparate topics, and they're all fairly complicated. There is a sort of general theme, which is essentially it's in the subtitle, America's Unipolar Fantasy. And according to that theme, the geopolitical imagination of Americans, and especially American political elites, has been enchanted by a particular vision, a way of looking at things that sees the world, first of all, as a kind of integrated global system, which is dominated by a single superpower, ourselves. And because we have this exceptional power, it endows us with exceptional legitimacy. National interest and duty compel us to lead the rest of the world. This way of looking at things has deep roots in American history. Its persuasiveness is buttressed by a sort of correlative geopolitical theory, which is also popular among American political elites, that the world is best off, we think, when it has a boss, that is to say, a dominant power that means well and keeps others in line. This is a very old theory of international relations, as you all know. It's rooted in the writings of Thomas Hobbes. To have peace within a state, Hobbes taught, there must be an irresistible sovereign power To have order among a group of interacting states, a hegemon is required. And this unipolar philosophy, if you like, is buttressed also by a popular view of modern history, again, especially popular among our elites. One that defines the 19th century as a sort of idealized Pax Britannica. It's a golden age of global free trade and investment animated by British finance, kept in order by British military and naval power. And for decades, this story goes, other states prospered, in a sense, as free riders on this system which the British maintain. And as other powers waxed, Britain's relative position waned. International order began to deteriorate. World War I was the terrifying consequence, and the obvious solution, as Woodrow Wilson understood, was that the United States should assume Britain's role. Britain no longer had the power, the Americans now did, and therefore should assume this hegemonic role. The isolationist America of the 1920s was unwilling, so World War II followed World War I. In his last years, the American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, did his best to have America rise to its global responsibilities. And this was a cause which was truly bipartisan in the sense that it was ardently embraced by the Republican candidate in the election of 1940, Wendell Willkie, who campaigned on the theme of one world managed by the United States, or Henry Luce, the great publisher, who talked about the American century, which was about to break out. After World War II, the story grows a bit more muddled and controversial, at least among American historians. Roosevelt's plan for a unipolar Pax Americana met, first of all, with strong resistance from our own European allies, in particular from Britain and France, but also, of course, from Soviet Russia. Stalin's opposition forced the American political imagination to adopt a new bipolar view, a bipolar vision, that is to say, a world organized around two competing superpowers. But anyway, after 4 decades of this Cold War, the rival superpower finally collapsed, whereupon the American political imagination began to revert to its unipolar vision. The Pax Americana was finally at hand. History had come to an end. The book argues essentially that these geopolitical and historical theories are dangerous oversimplifications. Above all, that the unipolar interpretation of the Soviet collapse was a serious misreading of the world that is in fact evolving. To begin with, the actual Cold War system was itself more complicated than the bipolar imagery implies. It was an error to see two blocks, each dominated by its superpower and dividing the whole world between them. The real world was already increasingly plural. In the so-called Soviet sphere, for example, China and Russia were often close to war throughout most of the Cold War. In fact, China and India were both determined to develop after the war in a third world where they could establish firm control over their own national systems before being drawn into a global economy. So that when they did open up and join the world, so to speak, they did so not as colonial satellites, but as nascent superpowers. In the West, meanwhile, the European relationship was always finely balanced during the Cold War, the European-American relationship. Europe enlisted American military power, of course, to balance Soviet military power. With the formulation of the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the EU, as you all know, in the 1950s, Europe also set out to balance American economic power, and on the whole has succeeded very well in doing this. And particularly with the opening of détente as a general Western policy in the 1960s, European states began to use Soviet political power to balance American political power. And the result was a set of relationships which I think are more accurately described as tripolar rather than bipolar, a set of Atlantic relationships. And from this perspective, the collapse of the Soviet Union did not so much cement America's hegemony over Europe as to remove the need for it. A Europe no longer depending on the U.S. For its security could look forward to a more collaborative relationship with a new Russia. And meanwhile, of course, by 1991, China was already a nascent superpower. In this plural system in the making, America's unipolar worldview was bound to be increasingly dysfunctional. Indeed, it threatened to pit the United States against all the world's newly rising powers, against the Chinese in Asia, against the Europeans in Europe, against the Russians in their own near abroad, against Muslims in the Middle East. All these people and many more had dreams of their own for the next century. And America's unipolar aspirations seemed inhospitable to them all. And it's no surprise then that ever since the Soviet demise, the United States has grown progressively isolated and embattled, with growing distortions to our own national constitution and overstretch and ruin for our economy, pointing to an unworthy denouement for our country's own noble continental experiment with democracy. Anyway, that's the broad argument and in particular in the book's first chapter. The next two chapters illustrate the dysfunctional worldview in action in two regions central to American foreign policy. Chapter 3, the Middle East. Chapter 4 deals with Europe. Now, I suppose before going on, there's an obvious question to be answered. The question is, hasn't all this changed with the election of 2008, or even you might say the election of 2006, the congressional elections? Well, for what it's worth, a critical argument throughout the book is that the Democrats themselves are often strongly attracted to the unipolar vision. They reject not so much Bush's view of America's world role as the way he conducted that role. As we know, Obama now is pressing for a major new effort in Afghanistan, spilling over into Pakistan. This is an altogether unpromising project. In effect, both parties are caught in this unipolar mindset where setbacks are the result of tactical mismanagement rather than strategic overstretch. As a result, unless, it seems to me, the unipolar fantasy is itself exposed, is pulled out and seen for what it is, and repudiated, the United States governed by either party will remain bound to an imperial vocation. And in that sense, Bush will prove to have been the election's real victor. Anyway, chapters 2 and 3 Well, let me say another issue, I suppose, is does this mean that the alternative for the United States is to be an isolationist America? And the answer is obviously not. The United States is the world's single greatest power. It will have a deciding role to play in the foreseeable future. But it is a role that we have to learn to play with greater respect for the ambitions of other great powers and lesser powers as well, and in a fashion with a restraint that allows us to sustain our own constitutional balances, develop our own national community, and not mortgage our economy far into the future. Anyway, these two chapters deal with the Middle East and with Europe. And chapter 3, the European chapter, concludes by asking, why do we follow this path? What are the assumptions that inform and substantiate this unipolar role and the worldview that goes with it? I come up with 4 assumptions. That America's soft power is irresistible, that America's hard power is incomparably superior, that America's economic power is invulnerable to the overstretch that has regularly defeated the hegemonic ambitions of other great powers, and that America's global ambition and power are recognized by others as intrinsically legitimate. Anyway, chapters 4, 5, and 6, which is the book's second part, examine these assumptions. Chapter 4 deals, for example, with America's hard power. We spend more on our military than do all other countries in the world combined. And the result is we have a military force which is without peer. Our problem, however, is weak enemies who don't fight by our rules, who specialize in insurrection and terror. So, though we're able to destroy quickly antagonist armies, antagonist states, we find it difficult afterwards to hold their territory or control their populations. And as a country, perhaps happily, we lack the patience and the means for long colonial occupations. As a result, however, our victories tend to replace rogue states with failed states. Our hugely expensive military strength is often not useful for the tasks of world management that our unipolar pretensions call on us to fulfill. And meanwhile, the runaway military budget is a major contributor to the fiscal chaos that now threatens the country's long-term strength and prosperity. Chapter 5, Feeding American Power, turns directly to this economic question. All along, the assumption of unlimited resources has been an integral part of the unipolar vision. As a result, we have been out of balance with the rest of the world economy now for several decades. We have, you might say, a credit card empire. And by now, financing this huge deficit absorbs most of the rest of the world's savings. The world has gone on financing our deficits decade after decade, thanks, it seems to me, to 2 special conditions, which are more political than economic. The first has been the geopolitical dependence of Europe and Japan on the United States during the Cold War. And the second is the international monetary system itself, with the dollar as the only serious reserve currency. This gave us the exorbitant privilege of printing the world's international money as we choose. Now, by the 1990s, it seems to me, both these special circumstances were coming to an end. The Cold War was over, and Europeans were creating an alternative money, the euro. And to be sure, this monetary denouement has taken a couple of decades to work itself out. The Clinton administration, in many ways, postponed the reckoning by balancing the budget and ending the country's fiscal deficit, logically enough, by cutting military spending. But private spending quickly replaced the reduced government spending. And at the current account deficit, that is to say the deficit with the rest of the world economy, grew larger and larger, despite the balancing of the government's own accounts. The dollar's vulnerability was covered for several years by a huge influx of private, mostly European capital, which was attracted to the dot-com boom of the 90s. Clinton's apologists decided the influx would continue indefinitely. This, the unipolar vision, in a sense, took on an economic dimension. The world was witnessing a new international division of labor. The United States, with its advanced technology and its financial savvy, would innovate, and meanwhile be the world's consumer of last resort. The rest of the world would save in order to invest in America and cover hard deficits. And by the end of the administration, however, the dot-com boom was a bubble, and the big foreign inflows dried up. And by the end of the Bush years, the dollar's exchange rate has come to depend heavily on the support of Japanese and increasingly, as I think everybody knows, on the Chinese central bank. Today, Obama's own exuberant spending, which is supported by huge credits created by the Fed, imply heavy pressure on the dollar's exchange rate. Chapter 5 doubts that Chinese support will hold up the dollar indefinitely. The present trend is a massive shift of China's resources to its own domestic development. That's certainly from a Chinese perspective the wise thing to do. But under these circumstances, America's capacity to create unlimited global credit for itself will grow harder and harder to sustain. An essential support for the unipolar vision seems fated to end. Now, the chapter then goes on to discuss China's increasingly significant global economic role. In an open world economy, China, with its huge workforce, its very low wages, its increasing technological sophistication, and big resources of capital, is likely to remain highly competitive against comparatively expensive labor in the West and elsewhere. Since ecological costs are likely to limit overall growth in the future, China's increasing share of the world's wealth will to a great extent be achieved at the expense of others. In other words, the Chinese economy will grow, but the world economy as a whole is restricted. Such circumstances, I suggest, favor protectionism rather than continuing rapid global integration. Instead of an ever more closely integrated world economy, we should probably expect one that is more segmented, regulated by political bargaining. Countries with relatively compatible economies will probably group together, perhaps around a dominant currency or a stable monetary union. Ideally, these blocs will remain reasonably open to each other. But given China's continuing competitiveness and the constraints on overall growth, the occasions for severe conflict will be very great. In other words, today's unfolding world trends do not promise automatic abundance and peace. It's not a liberal future. Instead, they point to a harsh confrontation between Asian growth and Western prosperity. In short, the book, in a sense, gives a Hobbesian diagnosis for world conflict. There is inherent conflict in these relationships, but it denies hegemony, which of course is the Hobbesian cure. The last part of the book looks for a formula to provide legitimate governance to this increasingly plural and conflictual world order. Chapter 6 focuses on how ideas of what make power legitimate have evolved within and among Western states. It elaborates on the shortcomings of both liberal and Hobbesian traditions, focusing instead on a third constitutionalist tradition, one that sees conflict as inevitable but hopes to control it by institutions that balance rather than concentrate power. Institutions that focus politics on the mutual conciliation of interests. By the late 19th century, this constitutionalist model was well embodied in the domestic politics of Europe's advanced states, but interstate relations remained essentially Hobbesian. And after World War II, West European states, sheltered by American power, began building a different sort of interstate system, one that was itself constitutionalist rather than Hobbesian. And to build their union, Europe's states retreated from their traditional global preoccupations. All this in sharp contrast from what has happened during the Cold War, where our government has turned resolutely outward to become a global empire by invitation, to borrow a phrase from a Norwegian friend here, Lundstedt. Naturally, this has affected our domestic constitution as well. Our own continental model has grown increasingly into a centralized federal system, able to project immense power abroad. Thus, while our domestic politics remain sort of uneasily constitutionalist, our foreign policy, seeking hegemony, draws its inspiration from Hobbes. The whole thrust of the book, however, is that today's world is inhospitable to hegemonic projects. The U.S. risks involving itself in a bitter struggle that it, in the end, cannot win. In our post-Soviet world, this anxious pursuit of hegemony threatens our prosperity and crowds our liberty. We should recognize, I argue, this lingering unipolar view for what it is, a facile doctrine that masks a too ardent taste for domination. Purging the American political imagination of this unipolar bias, it seems to me, is a task for liberals and conservatives alike. Liberals will have to overcome their traditional vice, which is enthusiasm for arrogant abstractions rolled forward regardless of what is trampled in the process. Conservatives have an even greater task, perhaps, and that is to rediscover their own traditional virtues, a constitutional respect for institutions and balance, for good manners within and among nations, together with a healthy reserve toward overheated, self-serving idealism. With luck, liberals and conservatives together can give us an America that is better adapted to the new century, an America that is less assertive, more self-confident. Indeed, I suppose we can hope that is what is happening now. Now, finally, Europe has its own transformation to make, to consolidate its own unity, to accept the responsibilities of its own great resources. If America is, you might say, too strong for its own good, it is not least because Europe remains too weak. That European weakness is a standing invitation to American overextension. Like all great powers, the United States needs to be checked and balanced. With so much power concentrated in Washington, something beyond a purely national constitutional framework is required. Keeping power in check at home requires balancing power abroad. Among states as among individuals, balancing is often better done among friends than between enemies, in a cooperative rather than a zero-sum relationship. To be Europe's stabilizing friend was America's vital post-war role. Europe, it seems to me, must now assume that role for our overstretched, disoriented, unipolar America. If America's political imagination regains its balance and Europe rises to the occasion, then there may be hope that the West can accommodate the new Asia, and that the 21st century may reflect Europe's new model for peace rather than its old model for war. Anyway, that's the hope of this little book. Thank you.
David, I think President Obama might claim that he's practicing what you're preaching, at least in his stated goals.
Oh, I hope so.
A far more conciliatory, cooperative approach to dealing not just with European allies, but even to rivals and potential adversaries like the Russians. Scaling back our stated aims in places like the Middle East, an explicit rejection of the notion that we could impose democracy on an alien culture, especially by force of arms. Secretary Gates's dramatic effort to restructure our military forces for the kind of occasions you quite rightly say we're more likely to face, which would mean more boots on the ground in places like Afghanistan, but coupling that with a lot more attention to trying to alleviate the sources of support for terrorism. Even in his domestic policy, trying to rebuild what he calls the foundations of our economic strength, with things like health care and education reform that could narrow the values difference with Europeans and make us more the kind of model to other countries we think we are rather than how they perceive us. It's early days. He faces enormous domestic as well as international obstacles to accomplishing any of this. But how would you rate his first 107 days of trying to move us in that direction?
Well, I think very well, in the sense that, as you say, the manners are excellent. The rhetoric is fine. I mean, he's saying all of the right things. On the other hand, we have to remember that it was Bush in his own election campaign who said, you know, we're far too interfering with the rest of the world. Who are we supposed to tell? Who are we to tell other people how to manage their affairs? So I think there is an enormous bias toward this continuing American role. I mean, you know this better than anybody. And we have this colossal Pentagon, even if, you know, I mean, I think it's wonderful. Since it seems to me that military budget is an example of a political system which is really out of control. So it's marvelous that Gates has pulled himself together to try to do something about this. But it's very early days, it seems to me. And, you know, it remains to be seen where all this ends up. As I mentioned, I'm not sure we have as yet a very realistic notion of what we could, what we can and are likely to accomplish in the Middle East. You know, I mean, exchanging the Iraq war for a war in Afghanistan, which then sort of casually encompasses Pakistan, you know, is not a very promising direction. I think we all know the tactical reasons why one thing may be exchanged for another, but the problem is that you get trapped in these things. So I think Obama's done very well, but it's early days. The economic side of all this, I mean, the enormous creation of credit will certainly create a big crisis for the dollar. you know, nobody can predict how these things unfold, but there's a kind of overwhelming logic in all this. And the rest of the world doesn't have the same geopolitical necessity for supporting the dollar as it did during the Cold War, as I tried to explain. And there are alternatives. I mean, obviously, not just the euro, but maybe the renminbi. I mean, who knows? Or gold. I mean, the things which seemed was rather preposterous even 6 months ago, now all of a sudden begin to seem, and in some parts of the world, of course, people felt this way for a very long time, but they've been right. I mean, in the sense that anybody who switched over to gold a few years ago is feeling very comfortable, which is a quite unique feeling, as we know, financially in the world. So,
questions from the floor, please. Arguments, disagreements?
Thank you so much. My name is Sonay Kamber. I'm a Fulbright scholar from Turkey, and I'm working for the Assembly of Turkish American Associations. In the morning, I had the pleasure of listening to Chris Patton, the former Commissioner for External Affairs, EU Commissioner. And I drew some parallels between your speech here and between his speech. He gave a very grim picture of European politics, and he actually listed the mistakes of the EU since the 1990s. And your picture of American hegemony and unipolarism isn't actually very positive as well. But he said that with a multilateralist at the White House, we Europeans feel much more at ease and much more comfortable about transatlantic relations. My question to you is, do you think that the multilateralism of President Obama, even if it is purely in rhetoric as of now, could still help the European Union in particular, to stabilize its own politics? Thank you.
Well, it's an excellent question. I don't know, you know, what the real answer is. Certainly, the almost open warfare which the United States was conducting politically against Europe in the Bush administration, particularly after the split over the war in Iraq, I think did a lot of damage to Europe. Whether that was damage that was going to happen for one reason or another, I mean, the fact that Europe is so divided now and hasn't really found its, you know, it hasn't gelled after this huge enlargement, is there, and I suppose lots of things could provoke, you know, the consequences of it. But surely it doesn't help to have the United States abandoning most restraint and openly playing off one group of countries against another. I mean, we've always done this, but not in quite such a brutal fashion. So the switch to Obama was somebody who has a sort of basic good diplomatic manners and realizes that there are limits to how far you should attack powers that you need as sort of basic allies. I mean, that's certainly an improvement. How much, you know, is hard to know. I mean, in some senses, we may look back at the Bush administration as the moment when Europe really began to take form. That's another way of looking at this. I mean, the American behavior was so outrageous that even the British, I mean, even we might say, Chris Patton began to act like Europeans as a reaction. That certainly didn't have any positive effects in the short run. Well, it may have had some, but not many. I mean, the negative effects seem greater, but over the longer term, you know, it remains to be seen. Surely, at the moment, I think what we can see is that the Germans are much more frankly pursuing their own national interest, but what they also see as a European interest. and they're by no means as deferential to American views. In fact, there's a kind of contempt for American views, which maybe has been there all along, but which now is heightened. So, you know, it's difficult to know. Europe has an enormous task to try to reconsolidate itself. I mean, this is, of course, what obviously complicates the question of Turkish membership in Europe. I mean, there's just so much on the European plate at this point that there's a kind of reaction. On the other hand, it seems to me that when Europe finally begins to see itself as a major power in the world, Europe's interests, essential geopolitical interests, lie in having good relations with its near neighbors, and they're essentially Russia, and essentially the whole Islamic world in the Middle East, with the United States in many ways is the problem in both these regions rather than the solution. And coming back to the Turkish question, once Europe begins to think seriously about, we cannot leave the Middle East to the Americans in this way because they don't have a solution. I mean, hopefully we will have a solution, but if we don't, it won't come as a great surprise. Then I think, to my way of thinking, then Turkey suddenly becomes much more important from a European point of view, because it is the key to European influence in this part of the world. So in a certain sense, Europe has to mature itself before it's mature enough to take on a strong power like Turkey. And in the meantime, Europe has these bouts of weakness.
Yes.
Hi, David Blum. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on if we were to reduce the unipolar world to what will affect to client states such as Israel or Georgia, or the effect it will actually have on the lack of security what goes on Somalia, and other places where the American military does provide a structural support of security where no other nation or region is willing to take that responsibility for?
Well, they're all different, these cases. I mean, I guess pirates are an old problem in the world, and you know, countries can pull themselves together to deal with it, as I think they are doing. We're playing a very important role in this, but by no means an exclusive one. The question of Israel is obviously extremely difficult. If Israel is really abandoning the two-state solution, I mean, the two-state solution is difficult enough to sell all around, as we obviously have learned over the course of half a century. But if they've abandoned that, then it's difficult to see any kind of peaceful resolution. And this then opens up a vista of the United States by its own brute force maintaining a situation which the rest of the region will not willingly accept. That's very expensive as a geopolitical burden. So if you think of the real interest of Israel, you know, you might say this turning of Israeli policy toward no accommodation of the Palestinians is not in Israel's interest. And if somehow the belief that the Americans will subsidize this indefinitely is not in Israel's interest, because it's enticing Israel into policies which are not really sustainable. And even if they are, result in a country which is progressively militarized. I mean, this is a rather sad evolution for what was, at its inception, a wonderfully idealist construction. I don't know enough about Georgia, except to say that the idea that Georgia can act as a great power, defying Russia, on the basis that there will be American help, this is again one of those interventions which isn't very useful. from the point of view of the Georgians themselves.
Suleiman Schwartz, Executive Director of the Center for Islamic Pluralism. Well, you've certainly fulfilled your description as a person who states provocative views, and I had 3 questions I was going to ask you, but I guess I'll limit it maybe to 1.5, or maybe to 1 and maybe 2. Twice you said, you described the situation in Afghanistan and Pakistan as being one where the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan had spilled over into Pakistan. My organization has a very large representation in Pakistan, and we've been reporting on and discussing the jihadist offensive, bloodshed in Pakistan, which I described in 2003 as ignored by the world, but in fact the second most bloodiest situation in the world after Iraq. That was several years ago. And we have very carefully followed this, and we don't see the United States spilling over at all until maybe 1.5 years ago. What we see is the Talibanization of Pakistan. So I would have to say that I think if you describe the United States as the situation there as a U.S. intervention in Afghanistan spilling over into Pakistan, you're just wrong. It's a Taliban invasion of Pakistan, and it really is an invasion.
No, I was saying the war has spilled over into Pakistan, and well, in a sense, our responsibilities in pursuing it now include a much larger region. That's what I was trying to say.
The Taliban does not come with books. The Taliban comes with guns, and they kill people.
So do many of us.
I mean, the Taliban invaded Pakistan, and they invaded it in a war. And there is no question at all, in fact, that the Taliban attack and jihadist attack on Pakistan has been going on for 5 years. And the United States, unfortunately, was fooled by Musharraf into believing that Pakistan could do something about this, when Musharraf was, in fact, unwilling to do something about it. In fact, acceded to it. So I don't know if you have an answer to that. My question, though, is, do you think that when Franklin said that the United States would be the beacon of liberty of the world, when Jefferson sent the U.S. Navy to fight the Barbary pirates, when the Monroe Doctrine was formulated, and when William Henry Seward said that he would leave the United States rather than allow the European powers to support the slave power in the Civil War, and finally when President Grant sent the United States Army to the borders of Mexico to help eject the French, do you think those people were inspired by Thomas Hobbes? As you've suggested that this expanded American role in the world is a Hobbesian role. Do you think those men were inspired by some Hobbesian view of hegemony? I think they were inspired by a purely American view of America as the leader of world liberation, and I think it was relevant in the days of Franklin, and it's relevant now.
Well, I guess again we'll go back to the beginning and think about Alexander Hamilton. You know, in some ways is the founding father of what the United States has become. And Hamilton certainly was Hobbesian, and his hero, of course, was Napoleon. I'm obviously not suggesting that every time the United States has used force throughout its history that has been seeking world domination. I mean, all powers use force for obvious reasons. They need to. But I think there is this vision of an integrated world led by somebody, which to some extent was invoked by the British in the 19th century, but not nearly as much as we seem to invoke it now. And I guess my vision of what the world, of what a plural world requires is to try to create, what's the right term, collegial relations, where everybody recognizes, like a faculty, as you well know, everybody recognizes everybody has his own interests. They somehow have to be accommodated. The genius of the European Union is that people just keep talking until they arrive at some kind of solution which everybody regards as a partial victory. Obviously, the bigger it gets, the more difficult that is, and particularly until these bargains have been struck, which takes a long time. And I think that is the inspiration of our domestic system. But we have gradually adopted a very Hobbesian view of the external. You know, we need an enemy, and then well, they're not hard to find, but sometimes we look too energetically.
You think Ahmadinejad is just like an encyclopedia salesman who just happens to occasionally say something we don't like?
Well, I don't know whether whatever is going on in Pakistan and Afghanistan is largely has to do with the United States at all. And you know, in that sense, the vision of this country parceling up the world and establishing order in places where it doesn't exist is, I don't think, a very promising view for our future.
I think we might have time for one more question. Yes.
My name is Marianne. I'm an Egyptian activist. I'm a fellowship with Freedom House organization, and this is my first week at my internship at Rumi Forum. I would like to thank you first for your informative presentation. And I have just one quick question regarding the new shift, or the apparently new shift in the American foreign policy, especially towards the Middle East. Do you think, and of course regarding the way things are in the Middle East concerning democracy and human rights as well, how do you see the future U.S.-Middle East relationships? And I'm not talking about Iraq as a war zone or a war situation, but I'm talking about the U.S. Foreign policy concerning apparently stable countries in the Middle East and the relationships between these governments. So how would you see the U.S. relationships with these countries in the future, and the effect of a possible American disinterest in change in these countries, in supporting democracy in these countries? And my second part of the question is, you mentioned something very important, is that there are hopes that someday there would be that different powers in the world would deal with the U.S. as friends, not just a zero-something relationship. Would that ever would exist in the Middle East sometimes in the future, that the U.S. government would deal with governments in the Middle East especially as friends? Thank you.
Well, there are lots of questions, and I can't pretend to be a great expert on all of these issues. Every country has its own history and its own problems. I guess if I had to make some kind of general prescription, which happily I don't, I think our policy would be better if it were less focused on military questions. I think, not that all those questions can be ignored, but a better solution would be the kind of thing the European Union does try to do, which is to build up regional economic cooperation, to try to improve the living conditions of countries, and to put them somehow on a more positive path. That being said, people have to do this for themselves. I mean, outside powers can encourage, they can facilitate, maybe. Sometimes they can enable, but I think the spark has to come from within. And maybe one of our problems is that we carry the spark.
Thank you all very much indeed.